This video is sponsored by Adaptroll. Blood Angels are a Space Marine chapter characterized by their masterwork artifice and divine aesthetic sensibilities, embodying the near unparalleled martial prowess of their late Primarch, Sanguinius, all while maintaining a festering madness within the heart of the chapter. On the tabletop, Blood Angels' armies are typified by almost unmatched aggression, threat range, and melee prowess, sporting powerful characters, elite specialist units, and a particular affinity for jump-pack infantry that will stir the blood of any fan of close-range assault. Welcome back to another Getting Started in Warhammer 40k video. In this video, we'll be discussing building an army from the Blood Angels chapter, breaking down its core abilities, taking the Combat Patrol and expanding it out to Incursion and later Strike Force game modes, as well as some basic tactics for using such lists in those game modes. Now, to start with, we need to talk about Space Marines and how Space Marines work. Blood Angels in 10th edition 40k are a Space Marine chapter. This means they have the unique privilege of being a sub-faction, one of the few sub-factions in Warhammer 40k. When you choose to build an army, you can choose Adeptus Astartes or Space Marines as your faction keyword. If you do so, you then have the option to select a chapter sub-faction. There are several of these available, including things like Ultramarines, Salamanders, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, and of course, Blood Angels. Now, if you decide to select a chapter keyword when building your army, you get access to any units that have that keyword on their datasheet, which means all of the specialist Blood Angels units. However, you lose access to any other chapter keyword units. You cannot mix and match your chapters. In addition, if you have any special detachments available to you, thanks to your chapter keyword, you also lose access to those if you do not choose that keyword to use. For Space Marine chapters that use the core Space Marine Codex, we typically call those Codex-compliant chapters. This is Ultramarines, Salamanders, Iron Hands, White Scars, Raven Guard, Imperial Fists. Those all gain an additional enhanced version of the Space Marine Army ability, Oaths of Moment. They gain +1 to wound when targeting their Oath of Moment target. Non-compliant chapters, which are chapters that have their own supplement codex in addition to the Space Marine supplement, do not gain this +1 to wound bonus. So Blood Angels in this case will not get the enhanced effect of Oaths of Moment if you choose to take them as your faction. That's because they will have access to a significant amount of additional specialist units and specialist detachments that offer them additional options and in some cases extra power level over a standard Space Marine army. So there is a trade-off for playing a sub-faction Space Marine chapter rather than playing normal Space Marines. Now, to be clear, for folks who are just starting the game, if you decide that you want to play Blood Angels, however, you want to get access to these special abilities, there's nothing that says that if you paint your army red, or if you build it in a Blood Angels style, that you must use the Blood Angels rules. While you have to use the Blood Angels chapter rules to get access to units like Sanguinary Guard, the special Blood Angels elite jump bodyguards, you can just play a regular Space Marine army that happens to be painted red if you want to get access to those other effects. And this makes Space Marines a pretty good introduction to Warhammer 40k, but that's neither here nor there. Now, at this stage, we have talked quite a bit about the Oaths of Moment ability, so let's discuss what it does. All Space Marine chapters, at least at the time of recording, have this army ability when they choose their army. This is in addition to any special detachment abilities they gain and is the same across all chapters besides the special ones that get +1 to wound. Obviously, that Blood Angels don't. Oaths of Moment instructs you to choose an enemy unit. It can be either on the battlefield or in strategic reserve. The only restriction is that it cannot be embarked in a transport when you choose them in your command phase. So this is after you draw your cards at the start of your turn, but before you make any moves or any other decisions. Or, importantly, roll battle shock checks. For the remainder of the battle round, so until your next turn, you gain hit rerolls when targeting that unit, allowing you to select one single enemy and ensure that your already relatively high weapon skill and ballistic skill army is going to be even more successful against that particular target. Now, one thing that a lot of factions like Blood Angels and similar Space Marine chapters that have both melee and ranged contingents do is actually build their army to be able to make good use of Oaths of Moment, but not necessarily rely on it, and we'll be talking about how we do that as we move on through our list construction. This video is sponsored by Adaptroll. Adaptroll's been a huge supporter of the channel for a while, so I'm excited to talk about them and their new updates. For those who don't know, this is a dice probability calculator app that can give you quick and easy access to expected dice results at your fingertips. So if you're wondering about particular unit builds, or you want to know what the best course of action in a particular game state might be, you can use Adaptroll to very quickly get those results by importing unit profiles and quickly spitting out expected damage. This can help you smooth your army list building or give you insights into the game. And their latest update takes into account a ton of player feedback, improving things like unit profile imports, making it easier to import your datasheets and their weapon stats into the dice calculator, a full modifier and ability section to more easily input all types of attacker and defender special rules, a wider selection of results to grant you a deeper understanding of the results, as well as a new text summary to more easily understand the math you're looking at in English. So follow the links down in the video description to get access to Adaptroll today. And big thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Now, with all of these videos, I always recommend that new players getting into the game or getting into a faction begin with a combat patrol. Now, the Blood Angels combat patrol is fairly reasonable. It comes with 2 units of Assault Intercessors, 1 Blood Angels Captain, as well as 2 units of Sanguinary Guard. Now, the Assault Intercessors are basic battle line infantry. They are very effective as delivery mechanisms for characters. The reason for that is that they grant wound rerolls to their unit when targeting an enemy that's on an objective. In most situations in Warhammer 40,000, enemies that are in a relevant position on the battlefield will be on an objective, especially heavily armored enemies that want to be trying to hold that objective in order to score it on the subsequent turn. So this ability is live more often than not. However, worst case scenario, they also grant a passive reroll once to wound bonus in addition to that. So they're fairly solid infantry. They're good at disrupting enemy objectives, although the downside is that they are not jump infantry and they're relatively slow. You won't use a ton of Assault Intercessors as you move on through your 40k career, but usually you'll use 1 or 2 units of 5, which is nice because that is what comes in the combat patrol. Now, the Blood Angels Captain is a great combination with the Intercessors. He has his ability Finest Hour to grant himself devastating wounds, which is mortal wounds instead of normal damage on a critical wound roll, which is typically a 6. And with wound rerolls from the Assault Intercessors, that's a great combination because he gets a higher chance of scoring more of those devastating wounds that are automatically going to pass damage through onto their target. Now, in this case, I recommend that you equip this guy with a Power Fist for the high strength characteristic, but obviously there are benefits to equipping the other weapon options as well. Last and certainly not least are 2 units of Sanguinary Guard. Now, Sanguinary Guard are typically bodyguards for Blood Angels heroes. However, in this case, we don't have any attachment options for them, which means that their special abilities won't be super pertinent for combat patrol games. However, they are extremely fast and they hit ridiculously hard. And especially once we start talking about comboing them out with some of the detachment effects that we're going to be adding later on during this journey, these guys are crazy good. So the combat patrol, including 6 of them that can be built into 2 units of 3, is huge. And as we move into larger games, we're going to be using them quite a bit. Now, with that, it's time to move on to incursion level games. And as always, once we move on to the incursion level points value, this is the 1,000 points value of Warhammer 40,000. Now we start to use, instead of using the pre-assembled combat patrols straight out of the box, we start to use Warhammer 40k's actual list building rules. So we have to choose a detachment. Now, the detachment I have elected to use for this initial incursion list is the Liberator Assault Group. This is a Blood Angel specific detachment, although if you are list building on your own, it's important to note that you can choose any of the generic Space Marine detachments in addition to this one if you want to. However, Liberator Assault Group has the most synergy with basic Blood Angels units. The detachment ability is incredibly powerful. It gives you +2 strength and +1 attack when your unit has charged. Importantly, this affects both when your units are charging during your turn. If you successfully made a charge during your charge phase, then in the subsequent fight phase, your unit's going to be more effective. However, it also will come into play if you use Heroic Intervention as well, which makes engaging into a Blood Angels army very difficult to do because they do have a lot of weird combat interrupt and combat sort of manipulation effects. They love melee combat, and they love getting into melee combat very quickly, and this detachment is great at it. It has effects like the aggressive onslaught stratagem that will allow your units to advance and still shoot or charge, meaning that it can compound very already fast jump infantry on the table with an increased speed, allowing you to get those jump infantry units into melee really easily. On top of that, it can also use Red Rampage to improve its chances in melee, giving its units lance and or lethal hits. Lethal hits gives you automatic wounds on critical wounds of a 5. This is good for high volume attacks, so things like chain swords. However, you almost always want to be choosing lance if you have the opportunity to do so. You also have a little bit of added flexibility thanks to Relentless Assault, allowing you to fall back and still shoot or charge. Importantly, this stratagem can be used on anything, and in fact, all of the stratagems can be used on anything, which means that you can do things like fall back vehicles out of melee and still interact with them. So there are a ton of really powerful synergies that this detachment has with your jump infantry and even with your more ranged focus elements as well, which makes it good at both supporting the fast, aggressive Blood Angels units, but also supporting a more well-rounded army, which is perfect for getting started in the game. Now, when discussing this incursion list, the combat patrol for Blood Angels runs around 480 points, so we're going to just about double it to go to the 1,000 points limit for an incursion game. What we have added in this case includes characters to attach into those Sanguinary Guard units to enable their bodyguard effects. In addition, we're also going to add a little bit of vehicle support and some additional jump infantry. So, in this case, we've added a pair of captains with jump packs. These guys can equip power fists if they'd like to, and they apply an additional leadership effect to your Sanguinary Guard. They give them +1 strength on the charge. Now, we are going to be using the Liberator Assault Group detachment, which gives them +2 strength for the charge, and these effects compound, meaning that if we equip the Encarmine Blades on our Sanguinary Guard, the Strength 6 weapons, which have a higher attack count and AP value than the Spear attacks, making them generally better in this detachment specifically, that brings them to Strength 9 on the charge, meaning that a lot of medium vehicles are actually being wounded on 4s. If we use Red Rampage to give them Lance, they actually wound almost any target in the game on 3s. Our friend, the Jump Pack Captain here, if he's starting at Strength 8 with a Power Fist, is actually going to go up to Strength 11, so he's even wounding heavier vehicles on 2s or 3s, which is crazy. The high strength characteristic of these guys, on top of the fact that, especially alongside that +1 attack that they get for charging, also gives them a high attack volume, which makes them good into almost any target. They can clip through infantry incredibly efficiently. They can also punch into heavy vehicles very efficiently as well. And on top of that, because the Sanguinary Guard have a -1 to wound effect while they're being led by a character, they become difficult to kill. I don't want to say impossible, but the fact that the unit has a 2+ armor save, -1 to be hit in melee, -1 to be wounded thanks to being attached with a character, and the character also brings along with it Rites of Battle, which let you use stratagems for free on the unit once per round for all of your Rites of Battle users. It's important to note that if one captain uses Rites of Battle, the other captain can't do the same thing, but that lets you do things like use Armor of Contempt a little bit more judiciously on these guys, which make them super sticky to get rid of unless your opponent has some pretty hefty damage output. So these little combos are not a particularly super expensive unit, but they're very good into basically any possible target. Now, from there, we've also added a unit of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors. These guys are kind of a staple in Blood Angels in general. The Blood Angels love to have a Jump Pack Infantry because they like to have that long threat range that they can add onto with their sort of additional threat range increasing abilities. On top of that, they love to have these kind of mid-weight but high-volume profiles. So, things like a Chainsword that you look at and it's like, well, it's Strength 4, that's an okay strength characteristic. However, once we add the Liberator Assault Group detachment ability on top of that, the unit, when charging, is getting +5 attacks and brings their Chainsword attacks up to Strength 6. That allows them to wound many vehicles on 5s instead of 6s. It allows them to wound a lot of light infantry on 3s or 2s, which makes them incredibly good at knocking opposing infantry off of objectives. And on top of that, they can also do mortal wounds on the charge. They can also just be used as a normal utility unit to score secondary objectives and wander around and perform actions and things like that. They're incredibly flexible and have such a synergy with the detachment ability because it lets them kill other infantry so efficiently that that's exactly where we want to be going. Now, we have included or kept the Assault Intercessors on foot. As I mentioned before, these guys have a great synergy with the Blood Angels captain because of his Finest Hour ability and the fact that he already has a pretty strong melee attack. However, we need a way to get them into the fight, and with that, we are bringing an Impulsor. So we can embark that unit into this Impulsor, carry them to the battle, and then disembark them into a relevant position and get a nice charge off with them. The Impulsor also then acts as a little bit of an independent unit itself. It has some guns on the top. It's got a stubber and a couple Stormbolters. For armies like this, I would recommend that you probably take a shield dome on top of it to make it a little bit more difficult to kill. In some cases, you could even equip like Sky Talon Iron Hail arrays, which are pretty cool. However, if you aren't really focused on empowering their ranged attacks, I would take the more defensive options. And so you get for a very cheap vehicle that can wander around and do important things, stand on objectives and stuff like that, but also you get a way to deliver this unit, which can deal some incredible power. Now, last and certainly not least, we have a Vindicator. One thing that Blood Angels armies oftentimes will need, and especially as you're getting used to the army and as you're getting used to Warhammer 40k, having a ranged element in your army to be able to reach out and touch enemies that you can't necessarily access with your melee infantry is always good. We'll expand this contingent as we move on to the Strike Force game mode. It's not strictly necessary for Blood Angels to play with ranged attacks like this, but I highly recommend if you are relatively new to 40k and you don't have a mastery of positioning, of staging attacks, and of the fight phase quite yet, then I would highly, highly recommend that you start with at least a couple of ranged attacks to help yourself out. Now, with that, we're going to dive into some tactics for using this army. Now, one thing that Blood Angels are going to be doing quite a bit, and we will certainly get into that a little bit more as we discuss the Strike Force game mode, is they are a huge user of staging attacks and of wave attacks. So oftentimes what you'll see Blood Angels armies do is set up a situation where they're going to attack with one unit that gives you cover to then set up your second unit to come in and attack, and you consistently hit your opponent with multiple of these kind of waves until they are absolutely out of pieces to retaliate against you, and then you're in a pretty good spot. And that's something that we can try to set up here in kind of a smaller circumstance with this smaller incursion level game plan. Now, one thing that you want to be doing with these jump back assault intercessors is using them both as a utility unit. So in this case, we have them set up so that if we wanted to, we could just move them up to stand on this objective for the majority of the game if we felt like that was necessary. However, the other thing that they can do is they can set up in a position where they can start to threaten opposing objectives. So another option is to start them into a position like this and move them either up here, or if you get a high enough advance, you can move them up here into a position where it's hard for your opponent to attack them, but they can clip out your opponent's units that they're going to go try to hold these objectives with. Especially on the charge, Blood Angels Assault Intercessors will probably kill most other utility, like objective holding units in the game. They are extremely difficult for most armies to contend with in that capacity. So you want to be able to use them as a disruption piece, meaning that you place them in a position where they can charge onto your opponent's objectives and regain control of those objectives. As you're doing that, using them either as an aggressive objective taker or as a utility unit that's moving forward to score points themselves, they can kind of create space for your other units to set up in a very similar position. Let's say, for example, that if we have units that are sort of going to be trading on this objective, we can then set up multiple units that can project their threat range onto that objective. So as long as you can keep your opponent off balance in this objective, the threat of things like your Space Marine Captain and your Assault Intercessors, as well as your Sanguinary Guard, moving onto the objective will keep your opponent from taking it. So you can use your long threat range, thanks to your long movement characteristic, and advance and charge from aggressive assault, in order to force your opponent to play farther back and give yourself control over objectives. Now, the Blood Angels Vindicator is very much going to be used as kind of a another pseudo melee piece. It has the opportunity to be able to shoot past where your melee units could potentially threaten to, but you putting it in a central position, for example, in this ruin, where it can potentially gain line of sight to areas of the table around this direction, or around this direction is very useful. Don't forget as well that you can use aggressive onslaught to advance and shoot with this thing. So if you're not using it to extend your melee threat range, you can actually use it to extend the Vindicator's threat range as well. So you can always, if you're given the opportunity to, move it up very aggressively and try to get line of sight around ruins or something like that, which is a nice little sort of use case for that guy. But the big thing with the Vindicator is that it's relatively resilient because it has a high toughness and a base 2+ save. And on turns where you are exposing your heavier units, your big melee units, like the Captain and the Sanguinary Guard, you can also push the Vindicator forward, try to get a shot off with it, and then your opponent will likely be out of resources to deal with both the Sanguinary Guard units and the Vindicator at the same time. That's kind of the concept of a push turn. That's very, very common in Space Marine armies, because oftentimes what they'll do is try to inundate your opponent with lots of these little tiny 5-man units and make it so that your opponent doesn't officially deal with them and doesn't then have enough left in the tank to kill their backline stuff, and that stuff gets to sort of trundle around in the late game and out attrition your opponent. So setting up a situation like that is always going to be useful. Now, in addition, I always recommend that players have something in reserve, and in order to force their opponent to screen or give themselves more flexibility on the battlefield. Blood Angels love using reserve mechanics quite a bit because they have lots of deep striking units. All their jump back infantry have deep strike built in. So the Sanguinary Guard are able to deep strike and come onto the battlefield out of reserve 9 inches away from enemies. Because you have a Space Marine captain in the unit, if your other captains are not using free stratagems, then you can use Rapid Ingress for free using Rites of Battle, which is very nice. And you can set these guys up in a position where, for example, they can set up behind this ruin. They can set up, maybe in this corner if your opponent hasn't placed any lines of fire in that area for a command point, and put themselves in a position where they can then advance and charge into something that's very valuable of your opponent's on the battlefield. So what you'll typically want to be doing is kind of starting the engagement with your jump back assault intercessors. They're sort of your trading piece. They're the least valuable piece that you have. In addition, you also have the impulsor unit that can start a stage behind a ruin in a central position. You get a little bit of additional movement from disembarking the impulsor. So your units are going to be, or your models in your unit are going to be placed wholly within 3 inches of the impulsor, so somewhere over here, and they're going to be able to use that boost as a little bit of additional movement. They can't disembark and charge after the impulsor moves, which is a downside. But if the impulsor's already in a relevant position, you can disembark the unit, then move them, and then potentially charge them, advance them, before charging, which gives them a pretty long threat range as well. So you have a lot of these little tiny units that are going to be projecting threat across the center of the table and either dissuading your opponent from moving into the middle, or putting them in a position where if they don't do that, you're going to outscore them on primary objectives. Now, the last thing to add is going to be the Assault Intercessor unit. You usually will need something to hold your backline objective, and the Assault Intercessors are pretty good at that. They're just a cheap unit that can sort of sit in the back and screen out your backline and hold your backline objective. One thing that you can do if you need them to in the late game is actually re-embark them into the Impulsor. The Impulsor is also kind of a great backline objective holder. Once it disembarks the Assault Intercessor unit, you don't really need it anymore. So you can then re-embark a different unit into it, or I guess use it to hold down an objective. Definitely don't be afraid to kind of recycle this unit and use it as an aggressive piece for the late game as well if you need to. But the other thing too is that if anybody comes in to try to attack your home objective, the Blood Angels Assault Intercessors, being relatively competent in melee, is good at killing other utility units. So if they're deep striking their own Assault Intercessors down or something, these guys are going to be able to potentially fight them off if you have the opportunity to. So it's definitely not like you are leaving value on the table for leaving a melee unit in the back here. They are definitely still going to be pretty good at protecting this objective. Now, with that, we're going to move into the Strike Force game mode, the 2,000-point mode for the game. Now, the list that I've built here is definitely an extrapolation of our 1,000-point Incursion level list. We've added more jump infantry. We've added a little bit more of a ranged element, as well as some support for our ranged element, but largely more of these big hammer units that we're going to be able to utilize the Blood Angel's prowess and melee alongside. Now, the biggest one is the inclusion of an additional Sanguinary Guard unit. We have 6 additional Sanguinary Guard in one big brick alongside the Chapter Master of the Blood Angels himself, Commander Dante. Now, Dante is a huge force multiplier for his unit. He adds a +1 advance, charge, and hit roll modifier to whatever unit he's leading, which means that if you're using them alongside a stratagem like Aggressive Onslaught, he's increasing their total threat range by 2 inches, once on the advance roll and once on the charge roll, which makes them blindingly fast. So this unit is incredibly scary. The fact that it has 6 Sanguinary Guard, plus Dante has 8 base Strength 8 attacks, which goes to 9 Strength 10 attacks once you're using the Liberator Assault Group Detachment ability, is pretty crazy. And the Sanguinary Guard in his unit are going to be hitting on 2s thanks to his leadership effect as well. So they don't necessarily need to have something like Oaths of Moment in order to deal a ton of damage on the charge with their base profile. Now, while their strength characteristic won't be quite as high as the other Space Marine Captain-led units, obviously they are more accurate, so their damage output is going to be generally the same, if not a little bit higher. And Dante himself hits like an absolute Mac truck, so generally they will be just as good, if not better. And the fact that there's 6 of them means that any buffs you put on them are going to go that much farther as well. So Dante's unit is going to be a huge inclusion here. They're going to be the hammer that you use to close out your games. Now, on top of that, I've also added some additional utility. We've added 2 extra units of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors. These guys, again, for all the reasons that I mentioned in the Incursion section, are going to be just as useful. And having 3 of them gives you so much more board control, ability to fight over multiple objectives, and ability to score passively over the course of the game, which is one of the things that Blood Angels are great at. Now, on top of that, I've added a second Vindicator in order to add a little bit more additional shooting to the army, as well as a Ballistus Dreadnought. Now, the Ballistus Dreadnought is unique because it is almost totally independent of your Oath of Moment. Oath of Moment gives your units rerolls to hit when they target a particular enemy that you've chosen. The Ballistus Dreadnought gets rerolls to hit if it targets an enemy that isn't below half of its starting strength. So this means that if it's a multi-model unit, it has not lost more than half of its models. And if it's a single entity unit, like a vehicle, it has not lost more than half of its wounds, which is honestly a really easy condition to trigger. So this guy's going to be getting hit rerolls 9 times out of 10, meaning that you don't need your Oaths of Moment when you're using these guys to deal damage. Now, we've added a little bit of additional support. Now, sue me here, this model is of an Infiltrator squad, but we are going to be adding them as Incursors to our army. They do come in the same kit, I believe, but they do look a little bit different. Although I couldn't find a good one on Tabletop Simulator for Blood Angels and Cursors, so we're stuck with the Infiltrators for now. But I've added them as an Incursor squad here. Now, the reason for this is that an Incursor squad is a nice utility unit. First of all, they have a solid melee attack, sustained hits 1, AP 1, strength 4. When they get +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge, that goes a long way. They can actually hit pretty hard. On top of that, they also have an assault weapon, so they can advance and fire their guns, and they give +1 to hit to your army in range when you hit something with their ranged attacks, because they're going to apply a scanning effect to it. This means that the Ballistus Dreadnought does not require Oaths of Moment to get hit rerolls. Most of the time, it's going to be hit rerolling normally. The Incursors can shoot a target, which causes the Vindicators to hit that target on 2s if they combine their shots together, which means they don't necessarily need Oaths of Moment. And Commander Dante's unit gets +1 to hit, so it's going to be hitting on 2s as well. So they also do not need Oaths of Moment. So importantly, the majority of this army, most of the attacks you're making on a turn-to-turn basis, do not need Oaths of Moment to work together, which means that you can put Oaths of Moment on something that your Jump Pack Captain units or your Assault Intercessors or something else are going to be charging to ensure that they get that kill. So building an army in such a way that you don't necessarily need it to have Oaths of Moment is a big deal. So that's a big part of the internal synergy here. Now, the other thing is that we have the Rage-Fueled Warrior enhancement on our Blood Angels captain. This gives him a once per game use of Sustained Hits 3, meaning that every time he makes a hit roll of a 6, it turns into 4 hits rather than just 1, which is crazy. It adds 3 additional hits to your attack pool. When you're targeting your Oath of Moment target, this guy can use both of his once per game abilities together. He can use Finest Hour for +3 attacks and Rage-Fueled Warrior for Sustained Hits 3 on those +3 attacks. This guy attacking into your Oath of Moment target then allows you to reroll all of your hits that aren't a critical hit, giving you Sustained Hits 3. So you're essentially rolling something like 15 dice and trying to get 6s. Each of those 6s quadruples the effectiveness of that attack, which is crazy. So the average damage from this guy is ludicrous once he has his devastating wounds, if he's getting wound rerolls and all that stuff together. He himself attacks 9 times if he's charging with all of those effects. That means that he's likely to get somewhere around 3 6s to hit, which turns into 12 hits, in addition to the other attacks that rolled normally from those 9 attacks, which is probably somewhere around 6 or 7. So he's probably hitting like 19 times out of 9 attacks, which is crazy. Once per game, obviously. It's a once per game ability. And if you're getting wound rerolls on those, he will probably one-shot almost anything in the game, which is an insane amount of damage. It does cost you quite a few points, but that's a good example of a unit that does need Oath of Moment. So if you are committing this guy to the fight, to one-shot whatever, you can put Oath of Moment on that target, then use the Incursors to buff your ranged attacks, use the Ballistus Dreadnought to affect itself with its ability, and use Dante to attack another thing in melee, none of those requiring Oath of Moment to be accurate, which then allows this guy to go absolutely crazy. And if you're obviously not engaging with him, you can use it for your jump back assault intercessors or your captain squads, for example. All of the things that I just discussed previously. So that's some of the combinations you can use. Now, I've added a little bit of additional utility into this list. There is another Invader ATV. This is largely in here to fill points, but these guys are very useful. They're kind of hard to kill. They're 8 wounds at toughness 5. They're a mounted unit, so they don't give up secondary objectives like bring it down, and they have a multi-melta on the back, which is pretty nice. So it's a nice little thing that you can go around and do actions with and hold down objectives and just sit on your back line and be a little guy to score points, which is always useful. Now, when we're talking about utilizing this army on the battlefield, the idea of this sort of Blood Angel style of a wave attack is really comes to the forefront. As always, I recommend that you place some amount of your units in reserve. Now, there's a bunch of different ways you can approach this, and as you get games in with this style of army, you're going to find the best units that you feel most comfortable with in reserve. Some number of assault jump back intercessors in reserve is always nice, mostly for secondary objective scoring, so you can have them kind of jump down wherever you need them to be. But also then keeping the Captain and Sanguinary Guard units free to rapid ingress is always good. Commander Dante is a very common rapid ingress option. So keeping him in reserve and allowing him to rapid ingress because he has all of the speed buffs for his unit does make him able to close the distance with the enemy army really effectively. Now, I guess it's important to note really quickly what rapid ingress does and exactly how it works, because it's one of the most important concepts for playing an army like this. Rapid ingress, as I mentioned in the incursion section, allows you to bring a unit onto the battlefield at the end of your opponent's movement phase. So importantly, you have total knowledge of, unless they have special abilities, where their army is at the time that you bring your unit onto the battlefield from out of reserve. The benefit of doing it in their movement phase is that then, at the end of their turn, it goes back to you, and you can then move that unit. So let's say, for example, our opponent has moved up to take this objective, and you have a unit available to rapid ingress. You know that their models are going to be standing inside this building. You can rapid ingress your unit behind this wall where no one can see them, so they can't be shot. You already know where they're all moving, so that's fine. And then, when it comes back to your turn, you can simply move this unit and then charge onto that objective. And that is how powerful rapid ingress is with these fast jump pack units. So keeping models available for that is always useful. Whereas otherwise, if you move your unit up normally to threaten this objective, your opponent can measure their threat range, know how far you can go, and try to stay out of it, which mitigates how powerful that unit is. Obviously, it allows you to project threat on the battlefield, but it doesn't necessarily allow you to get them into combat more easily, and the game can very easily stall out. So having these rapid ingress threats and having areas of the battlefield where they can easily hop in and threaten opponents' movement is huge. Now, another thing to do with rapid ingress, and especially with lighter units like the jump pack intercessors here, is ingress them onto objectives, which a lot of people don't necessarily account for, myself included. I actually get caught up by this all the time. I'm very embarrassed constantly. But if your opponent does not screen out any of the primary objectives and they don't have models in a position to attack them, you can always just use rapid ingress to place a single model on that objective so that when it comes back to your turn, you can hold the objective. So having Deep Strikers in reserve to be able to do that is a huge boon. The other option that you have with this army is placing Commander Dante and his unit on the battlefield. As I mentioned before, he's a very popular rapid ingress threat. However, he's also very fast in the table. You can assume, essentially, if you're planning on using aggressive onslaught to give his unit advance and charge, you can kind of think about his leadership ability as +2 movement, making this unit essentially move 14 or so, because they're going to get +1 to each of their rolls, both advance and charge. If we are taking an average movement characteristic into account, a 3d6 roll is somewhere around a 10, pretty realistically. Plus, you can engage things at 1 inch, which means that if you are advancing and then charging, it's 1d6 to your movement for the advance and 2d6 movement for the charge, meaning that the average threat range of this unit, when it's advancing and charging, is +12 inches. 10 on average from the 3d6, +2 from the bonus to advance and charge roll. So Dante's unit threatens, on average roll, from the very beginning of the game into your opponent's deployment zone. And so having him on the battlefield early is a huge consideration to your opponent. As soon as he goes down, your opponent gets to go, oh my god, where could Dante be, and what is he going to do? Because anything his unit touches is likely to just evaporate. So they have to be very careful about this huge brick of guys. And you can use that to slowly kind of edge them up the battlefield and project that threat range almost anywhere that you need to be. So like in this case, right, if Dante's standing on this objective, he's threatening very easily basically either of these objectives or into your opponent's deployment zone, even if they hide back here. He could potentially make this charge really easily back to this area. So in that case, your opponent has to really consider about where they want to stand, because Dante could always be in a position to go get him. So that's why I like Dante being placed on the table, but definitely not. You don't 100% need to do that in every single game. And you'll get a good sense of when to rapid ingress and when to deep strike as you get more reps in with Blood Angels. But that's one of the biggest benefits of Commander Dante, is how insanely fast his unit is. Now from there, what you want to do, as I mentioned before, is you want to set up your Jump Back Assault Intercessors to kind of instigate the fight. You don't want to give them away for free, but you want to either stage them in positions where your opponent can't really hit them, or where your opponent has to overextend to try to kill them. Then use that to draw them forward so that you can counterattack with things like your Sanguinary Guard or your other units. The ideal situation is you set up a situation where, for example, you attack one objective or two, flanks, for example, with your Assault Jump Pack Intercessors. Then you rapid ingress a Sanguinary Guard unit and either engage with them at the same time, or set them up to engage or counterattack the next turn. Your opponent has to deal with all these units that are pushing forwards. That gives you cover to move forward your vehicles and your transports as well, so that you can try to get shots on them or put them in a position where they're going to get shots in the future. Your opponent deals with all your jump infantry in the front. However, in doing so, has given you a stage to the middle and a position where you can potentially rapid ingress your second Sanguinary Guard unit. At that point, Dante's probably in range to attack, and these guys are probably in range to attack. You then have a position where you've kind of absorbed the center of the battlefield, and your opponent, if they are not walking into your threat range, is either far enough back that they can't really engage with you here, or they're just being charged by Dante, and Dante is either killing them or keeping them stuck into their own deployment zone. If you can do that, and each of these units can trade 1-for-1 with your opponent's units, you'll eventually attrition them out to the point that they can't really contend with the tanks and the ground-based infantry towards the late game. And at that point, they've lost the game. So you kind of, Blood Angels want to essentially set up a situation where they can threaten to the deployment line and give themselves the opportunity to set the line of engagement on your opponent's deployment line. They want to be able to keep pushing their units into melee. I don't want to say that you want to just run your units into the middle of nowhere willy-nilly, but they always want to set up a situation where they can push their units onto your opponent's deployment line and be killing things there, because that stops your opponent from being able to move and be live on scenario. And over the course of that game, Blood Angels, even if they suffer a lot of casualties, they will win that game 9 times out of 10. If your opponent doesn't have really good ways to deal with very aggressive pushes like this, Blood Angels are absolutely dominant in a lot of matchups. There are a lot of armies where the other team doesn't have what it takes to sort of absorb these constant aggressive attacks and still come back later on in the game, and Blood Angels can absolutely ruin their day. And that's what's so fun about them too, is that you just get to play hyper aggressive, and you just get to play kind of what World Eaters wish they could be, where you're just running dudes into your opponent's deployment zone all the time. So that is my build for Combat Patrol up to an Incursion style of game. But those are not all of the available builds for Blood Angels. If you want to expand this collection even farther, one unit, largely because it's a little complex, but one unit that I didn't recommend that you take, however, is another extremely viable unit, are things like Death Company Jump Pack Marines. With attachments like the Chaplain Lamarties, these guys are a huge bulwark that can be used to kind of bludgeon your opponent down. They are very difficult to kill, especially for a lot of things that kills most Space Marine profiles, because Lamarties gives them a -1 damage effect, and they stack on top of that a Feel No Pain and any other defensive mechanics that you might be adding onto that. So they are incredibly difficult to deal with. They're another really interesting unit. And you can also cycle that into playing other detachments, either in Blood Angels or in Space Marines proper, where you can play things like Angelic Inheritors, where all of these little tiny character units, things like Dante's unit, things like your Jump Captain with Sanguinary Guard units, gain passive benefits for having a character inside them. There's also really unique synergy with units like the Sanguinor in that detachment, also units like Jump Pack Inceptors with Plasma or Bolter attacks. Those guys are also have a lot of really interesting synergy with that same detachment as well. So lots of ways that you can expand this army into Blood Angels. If you're looking for a little bit more of a ranged, focused army, you can expand into some of the standard Space Marine archetypes as well. You can play things like Gladius Task Force, largely going to feel a little bit less powerful than Liberator Assault Group, but it gives you a lot more options for ranged attacks if you want to play a little bit more like that, while still supporting your Sanguinary Guard units just almost as well as your Liberator Assault Group does. So there's a ton of flexibility within the Blood Angels roster for interesting ways to expand out your collection and expand out how you play the army.